So, the R8 revolver. Like many of the new weapon additions to CSGO, the R8 revolver began life as a completely broken and overpowered meme of a gun.
This gun!
Whether it was just a clever ploy to sell new cases, or just an incompetent oversight, the R8 was eventually nerfed down to competitive irrelevance. But with the somewhat new R8 price drop and major pistol changes, things may be starting to look a bit better for the R8 revolver. Unfortunately, that's not saying much, as any small shred of R8 usage would technically constitute as better, since the weapon's competitive usage has pretty much remained non-existent since the previous nerfs. Still, the question remains, will the current pistol changes breathe new life into the R8 for the current competitive meta, or will it remain the most irrelevant pistol in CSGO? Of course, before we get into the bulk of this breakdown discussion, we first need to take a quick look at some weapon statistics. Like usual, I won't be discussing all of the R8's weapon statistics, but just the ones I find to be important and/or interesting. As always, all of the weapon statistics used today can be found via Sloth Squadron spreadsheet, which will be linked in the description box below. So, to start things off, at the now reduced price of $600, the R8 has dropped to the second most expensive pistol in CSGO. For its reduced price, the revolver comes with an 8-bullet capacity with only 8 extra rounds in reserve. As stingy as its ammunition may be, each bullet makes up for the fact by doing a whopping 86 raw damage per bullet. That's easily the strongest raw damage for all pistols, as it even contends with most sniper rifles in this aspect, being only second to the AWP in terms of raw damage. Likewise, the revolver also contains some of the highest armor penetration values in the game. At 93.2%, the R8 ties with the Desert Eagle in terms of highest armor penetration. But considering that only the SG553 and AWP contain higher armor pen values, tying for first hardly seems to matter in this particular aspect. In addition, the R8 also boasts the maximum surface penetration, highest pistol tagging rate, and the best pistol damage falloff over 500 units. Unfortunately, besides the R8's excellent raw damage and ranged effectiveness, it contains the absolute slowest pistol mobility and the worst pistol fire rate at about 120 rounds per minute. Not to mention its extremely strange firing mechanism that delays each bullet, but more on that later in the discussion. Of course, the R8's alternative fire shoots in a more instant traditional sense, increasing its rate of fire to about 150 rounds per minute, and weirdly enough also boosting mobility to 220, but even so, both values are still pretty bad considering they are well below the pistol averages in CSGO. So, combining some of these statistics together, even though the R8 boasts excellent raw damage and armor penetration, it's still not enough to offset its extremely slow rate of fire, as the R8 contains some of the lowest DPS values against unarmored opponents and some of the worst DPS values against armor. Worse yet, the R8 contains one of the slowest consolidated reload times, with a 1.97 clip ready and 2.27 fire ready time. Of course, the R8 was never meant to be a voluminous mag dump weapon, so things do start to look much better when addressing weapon and accuracy statistics. So, taking a quick look at the R8's inaccuracy statistics, everything seems to be on the up and up. It not only possesses the best standing inaccuracy at 2.52, but also possesses the best crouching inaccuracy at 1.52, both of which are well below the pistol average and leagues above even the second best inaccuracy statistics for both categories. Now, while it's probably unsurprising to see the R8 top the best standing and crouching inaccuracies, it is rather surprising to see that it also contains the best running inaccuracy of 9.02. That's not only the lowest for all pistols, but it's actually the lowest running inaccuracy in the entire game. On the opposite spectrum, the alternative fan firing mode retains terrible inaccuracies all around, rivaling that of the unscoped AWP for worst inaccuracies in CSGO. But that's sort of what you expect from what is essentially a panic mode for the R8 revolver. Also, strangely enough, the R8 also contains some of the best ladder and jumping inaccuracies in the game. but regrettably, both are still not good enough to be considered usable, especially for such a slow-firing weapon with limited ammunition. Anyways, combining the R8's incredible accuracy statistics with a decent recoil and an accuracy from firing, it's an incredibly accurate pistol at pretty much any distance. However, with the highest recovery time for both crouching and standing, holding down mouse 1 and firing in rapid succession is somewhat inaccurate. But truthfully, it's not as bad as it seems on paper, considering how slowly the weapon fires in general. But it is noticeable enough to make a difference, especially on targets at longer ranges. With that said, how should you use the R8 revolver? Well, as most of you have probably guessed, the R8 is pretty much a sniper rifle in pistol form. With its absurdly large base damage, armor penetration, and extremely slow fire time, it's best to use the R8 at medium to longer ranges. While it is possible to use at closer ranges, I would advise against it due to its excessively delayed firing mechanics. Although the R8 does possess a fan firing mode specifically for those panic CQC situations, it's extremely unreliable unless you can physically jam the gun in an enemy's face. Yet, most people seem to try and use the R8 like something out of Overwatch. That's probably due to the R8's bizarre firing mechanics, but honestly, if you really wanted a CQC spam pistol, there are plenty of better options. On a side note, it doesn't really make sense that a double-action revolver takes almost a full second to shoot manually. You know, unless the trigger pull weighs something upwards of 30 pounds, but then again, you shouldn't even be able to fan fire a double action in the first place. So, whatever, I guess. Anyways, the delayed primary firing mode, which I will now refer to as a charge shot, is probably the most unintuitive style of shooting for a quote, realistic FPS game like CSGO. As such, it does take a lot of practice to get used to when firing each shot. So, unfortunately, the R8 also requires buffering practice to lead shots or to effectively pre-fire corners. But once you're comfortable with the R8's timing, it's actually a pretty good stationary weapon to use in a peekaboo fashion. As we've seen, the R8 is exceedingly accurate while stationary, so abusing cover while taking pot shots helps to limit the weapon's main drawback of its dreadfully slow firing speed. In fact, because of the R8's amazing running and accuracy, you can even get away with taking pot shots while on the move. Speaking of which, while using the R8 in a purely stationary aspect certainly suits its strengths, it's actually not a bad idea to shoot while running at full speed, even at range. I know that may sound strange, but let me explain. Again, with the best running and accuracy in the game, the R8 is surprisingly accurate at even long ranges when on the move. Of course, it's nowhere near perfect, but the trick is to aim for center of mass instead of at the head. As counterintuitive as it sounds, when running and gunning with the R8, you're not going for the insta-kill headshot, but instead, you should be going for the chunk damage assist, with the added bonus of making yourself a harder target to hit. With the revolver's excellent raw damage and armor penetration, one shot to almost anywhere on the body will leave an enemy with sub 50% health. Combine this with its 60% tag rate, and you can probably see why the revolver makes for an outstanding ranged assist weapon. Of course, that's not to say that you should always run and gun with the R8, as you should obviously use a mix of stances and movement depending on the situation, but you would be wise to incorporate its mobility strengths. Because, let's face it, if you wanted a standard dueling pistol, then you probably should have bought a Deagle instead. So, when should you buy the R8 revolver? Honestly, this is a question I struggled with myself, because as much as I like using the R8, there really is no right time to buy it. Sure, there are niche uses for the gun as it remains a solid ranged pistol, but for almost every situation, there are just better, cheaper, or easier to use alternatives. In fact, even with the price reductions and various pistol nerfs, the only changes I've seen to the current pistol meta involve an increase in CZ usage with a small sprinkling of dual elite raid bosses on pistol rounds. Rarely have I seen an R8 revolver buy outside of meme usage or casual play, and probably for good reason. Normally I wouldn't be so negative about a $600 pistol, but because the R8 specifically takes up the Desert Eagle slot, there is very little upside to fielding the R8 revolver. But let's assume you want to use the R8 anyways. Based off of the accuracy statistics, I can see why most people would assume the R8 to be a CT-sighted pistol, as its base accuracy values and large chunk damage are great for holding stationary spots under cover. However, when used in such a manner, it really doesn't have much of an advantage over the Desert Eagle, even with the higher damage and tighter spread. The Deagle's firing speed and ease of use more than make up for the deficit. That being said, the one facet where the R8 truly excels over the Desert Eagle is once again within its running accuracy. For example, on T-side Mirage, it's fairly common for CTs to play the left side of window at mid. So when fielding an R8, you can actually pre-fire that angle for chunk damage while also running at full speed. Now, while the newly nerfed Tech 9 may be comparable in terms of running and accuracy, it has nowhere near the same one-shot chunking ability of the R8 revolver. So I tend to favor the R8 as a T-sided pistol, to make use of its ranged firing mobility. While it may require some teamwork to be fully effective, the R8 is genuinely a sneaky good buy for T-side pistol if used correctly. In fact, because of the recent accuracy buffs to the Glock along with the R8's reduced price tag, not only are you now able to afford an extra flash on pistol, but it's also much easier for teammates to pick up the assist on chunked enemies at longer ranges. Now, while the R8 definitely provides less utility than the Desert Eagle in most dueling aspects, with practice it's still a pretty strong ranged weapon when forcing pistol armor. As such, you could feasibly get away with using R8 armor on eco rounds or almost any instance where you would normally buy a Deagle armor, provided you play to its strengths. That being said, unlike the Deagle, I would not suggest using the revolver as a secondary weapon for snipers. As tempting as 86 raw damage may be, the R8's dreadfully slow charge shot and stupidly inaccurate fanfire are extremely punishing should you miss the first shot. So, as bad as the newly nerfed Tech 9 and P250 have been, they're still more reliable and cost-effective than the R8 in terms of close-range utility, giving them priority status as secondary weapons. So, in conclusion, the R8 is not a completely useless pistol. Although the weapon has seen its fair share of justifiable nerfs, it still maintains excellent damage, armor penetration, and inaccuracy statistics. However, the weapon is severely hindered by its unintuitive shooting mechanics and its forced competition against the Desert Eagle. While the R8 does fill a specific niche, and rather well I might add, there are plenty of other cheaper, more cost-effective, and easier to use pistol options at hand. As such, the once overpowered R8 revolver has thusly been relegated to meme status, only being used as a sign of disrespect or for footage by irrelevant YouTubers such as myself.
Hey, irrelevant.
As much as it pains me to say it, the R8 really does need a buff, or at least some changes for competitive relevance. Personally, I would like to see at least an increase in reserve ammunition, as 16 bullets total is not nearly enough. In fact, the R8 would have made for an outstanding wallbang gun, if not for its severe lack of overall ammunition. Besides that, the R8 really needs to be moved to another pistol slot, so as to not contend with the iconic Desert Eagle. Honestly, it might be better suited to swap out with the dual elites so there can be a designated meme slot for pistols in CSGO. But if Valve really wants the R8 to compete with the classic Deagle, then there's actually an obvious addition that a few of you might know I'm going to suggest. Just put a scope on it. But in the end, that's just my opinion. There's no way I covered everything, and all of this is just advice. So, what do you guys think about the R8? Is it worth purchasing over the classic Desert Eagle? Or is it now only a meme gun like the sadly neutered Negev? Does it need a buff to enter competitive relevance? Or should it remain the Dark Souls of CSGO pistols?
Move this man!
Well, whatever the case, it's still the most irrelevant pistol in CSGO.
Irrelevant.